Hey everybody. So I was planning on making a video where I recount and expand on this piece that I published at The Spectator yesterday, Friday, on impeachment and Bernie and Moore and Mueller and such. But just to begin here, I do have to note how bizarre it is that a mass shooting occurred yesterday in Virginia Beach. 12 people were killed, 13 including the perpetrator. And this is just going to fade into the background within, maybe 24 hours. Whereas in other developed societies, if 12 municipal office workers were randomly gunned down in the middle of a workday, it would be a giant social controversy, political controversy. It would just dominate general consciousness of the society for quite a while. I mean, the New Zealand mass shooting from a couple months ago still seems to be dominating that society, and that was on a greater scale than the one yesterday, but we are really getting numb to the inevitability or the recurrence of these kinds of events. And it's not to say that there haven't always been spectacular acts of random violence in U.S. history. There have. But these particularly tailored mass shootings for maximum casualties happening every, roughly 6 months, sometimes less. That really is a unique feature of American life, and I'm not prescribing any policy solution necessarily. Or I actually tend to think that there's not a whole lot that can be done about it, which seems wild, but does seem true. I mean, it's very much ingrained in the culture. And one thing I just pointed out on Twitter, and I'll repeat here, is that if you go and look at who some of these recent mass shooters were, so in this past few years, the most common characteristic among them, so the thing on which they have the most commonality, isn't their race, isn't, their religious background, that kind of thing. It's that they have a military or law enforcement background. And think of how deeply embedded the military and law enforcement are in American culture. I don't know how you ever extricate that influence from the broader cultural milieu. You probably cannot, at least not on a policy level. And of course, it should go without saying that everybody who serves in law enforcement in the military is not automatically prone to committing mass murder, or at least a mass shooting of these sorts. But still, I mean, it is a trend. This person who did the Virginia Beach mass shooting, Dwayne Craddock, let me just double check that I have his name right, because I don't want to be libeling anybody. I believe I did, but always want to be sure. Yeah, Dwayne Craddock served in the Virginia National Guard for 17 years. Doesn't appear that he ever saw combat, although you'd wonder why, because in that 17-year span that he served in, had 2 wars. So I'd actually be curious for more information on the nature of his service. Anyway, but look back in the last couple of years again. Ian David Long, who in November 2018 committed a mass shooting in Thousand Oaks, California, killing 12, was a Marine and a veteran of the war in Afghanistan during the most violent period in the Afghanistan war for American soldiers, which was 2010-11. Nicholas Cruz was in the high school Army ROTC. I'm not saying he wasn't active military. I'm saying, roughly speaking, a military background, and that if being in the ROTC is what you're inclined to do. You, in some sense, are imbibing the values of the military, which, again, to repeat, doesn't mean that you're going to commit mass murder. We're just discerning trends and kind of piecing together variables for this relatively small group of people, meaning the kind of person who's able to pull off a high casualty mass shooting. Devin Patrick Kelly, who in 2017 shot up a church in Sutherland Springs, Texas, was in the Air Force. Stephen Paddock, the Las Vegas shooter, deadliest mass shooting in U.S. history. Also in 2017, worked for the Defense Department and Lockheed Martin. Again, non-active duty military, obviously. I'm speaking in more generalities in terms of if you work for the Defense Department and Lockheed Martin, you're in some sense exposed more than the average person to military culture, right? Then Omar Mateen, 2016, his primary motive was avenging U.S. foreign policy because he said it was killing too many Muslims. But he shot up the Orlando nightclub in 2016, which was then the deadliest mass shooting in U.S. history, when he had been working as a private security guard and he wanted to be a cop, and he obviously had firearms experience from that. And there are more examples. I mean, I could go down the list. Aaron Alexis, 2013, committed a mass shooting at the Washington Navy Yard. He was in the Navy. So I'm not making a strict causal link here. Obviously, we're dealing with a very small subset of individuals. But if you want to infer commonalities, that's one you got to deal with. And it's one that gets to the in a fundamental way, it gets to the roots of American culture. And, obviously these were all males. And that should also go without saying. And before you even say it, I know that there are exceptions. I covered the Newtown shooting in 2012 fairly extensively. Adam Lanza was an aberration, it seems like. Had no military background to speak of, was just incredibly antisocial. Was actually very intelligent, actually. As was Paddock, it seems. Anyway, it's just amazing to me that we just had this. And, I'm going to talk right now about a different subject, whereas, you'd think in maybe a more healthy society, it'd be dominating the topical discussions of the day on every form of media. And, it'll get some coverage, but, we'll forget about it in 2 days. I'm actually sort of a connoisseur, weirdly, of mass shootings, so I tend to retain the information from them. But anyway, okay, so I did this column or article at The Spectator, and it has to do with how critical this past week was in terms of accelerating the drive toward impeachment. This week was the most critical week by far in making it almost a certainty that at the very least impeachment proceedings are going to be initiated at some point. Why do I say that? Well, as I discussed in a previous video, and I talked about with Dershowitz, if you listen to that podcast on the channel or through your audio device, Mueller was making a political statement on Wednesday when he came out with his first public remarks. There's no other way to interpret his statement. What he was doing was attempting to instigate impeachment as a prosecutor. Now, prosecutors mostly are not in a position where it's anywhere near in their authority to be recommending political action in that way. But Mueller, obviously, he's very sure of himself, very confident, probably in a hubristic way. So he said, all but explicitly, that he was encouraging Congress to initiate impeachment proceedings against Trump. He said that the way to hold accountable a president for wrongdoing is not through the criminal justice system, but through other processes. And the only process available to achieve that outcome is impeachment. So Mueller has now become a political actor because impeachment is an inherently political process, and has stepped beyond his prior role as this kind of paradigm of, apolitical, nonpartisan rectitude. That's not what he is anymore. He chose very deliberately what to emphasize in that 9-minute public statement. And he emphasized the need to initiate impeachment proceedings. So that's just inherently political. So that's why you had multiple presidential candidates almost immediately after Mueller's speech, or remarks, or whatever, revising their position on impeachment and demanding that it be initiated right away. Cory Booker did that, and Kirsten Gillibrand did that almost right after Mueller's speech. Later on, Bernie Sanders, for the first time, explicitly endorsed the initiation of impeachment proceedings, which he had been reluctant to do for some time. So now you have virtually all the top-tier presidential candidates that are Democrats advocating impeachment, or at least the initiation of impeachment proceedings. So you have to be precise with your wording here, because it doesn't mean that they're ultimately saying that the House should vote to impeach. It means that they're saying the House should begin impeachment proceedings. So there's an important distinction there. But nonetheless, that means the pressure on Pelosi and Nadler and all the other members of the House who are actually going to be instrumental in effectuating impeachment proceedings, the pressure on them right now is enormous. They're probably going to slow walk it for a little while longer, but it's not going to be tenable indefinitely. I would say, I don't want to predict exactly when it's going to be initiated, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was within a month, 2 months, something like that. Don't hold me to that. I'm not making a hard and fast prediction. I'm giving you what my, impression is. And whether they ultimately vote to impeach, I think we have to see how it plays out. That I'm not even willing to make a rough speculative prediction on at this point. So anyway, this kind of... Oh, and by the way, before I go on, there are 2 great columns by Jonathan Turley at The Hill that he wrote this week on Mueller's bizarre, fallacious reasoning as to the timing of his various statements, how he handled the submission of the report, his interactions with Bill Barr. Jonathan Turley does an excellent job at dissecting all this in 2 separate columns from this week, and I'll link to both of them. One of the most egregious is that Mueller was requested by Barr and Rosenstein to, when he submitted his report on March 22nd, undertake a process whereby the material in the report that had to be redacted per grand jury restrictions would be marked. So Barr and Rosenstein could go through and redact that material and then expedite the process of releasing the report. Now, Mueller did not do that. He didn't comply with the request. So that led to a delay where it took Barr until April 18th to release the report, where Barr always insisted he wanted to get it out as quickly as possible, and there's no reason to believe that he wasn't being truthful about that as his desire, seeing as he requested that Mueller help him accelerate the process by marking the grand jury material, and it took a long time, or relatively long, for him to go through and figure out what had to be redacted by law. It wasn't an option to have that stuff redacted. He had to, or he would have been violating the law. So why didn't Mueller mark that material? Well, what Turley speculates is that it was a political machination. Meaning, if there was this delay between the submission of the report and the release, obviously that would create intense speculation about Barr covering stuff up, or Barr, defending Trump or whatever. So Barr was put in this quandary where he had to say something to the public, or else people would have been running around with their heads on fire, while he was undertaking this process to redact the necessary portions of the report. So he put out this letter, a summary letter, on March 24th, which now people are saying was so flagrantly misleading and blah, blah, blah. Mueller actually said in his statement that he actually believed Barr was acting in good faith. But again, this was a political statement on Mueller's part. So you have to very finely parse what he's saying, what he did not say, his potential motivations for saying it. And it does seem that it's a plausible theory, as Turley lays out, that Mueller intentionally wanted to generate that suspicion for the ultimate purpose of instigating impeachment. Because if you think Barr is covering something up, then that's going to get the ball rolling on impeachment, because the House is then going to feel like they've been deceived and they have no choice but to use impeachment as a means to get the full truth or whatever. And the other issue that Barr touches on, and also Andy McCarthy from National Review touches on, I don't agree with a lot of what Andy McCarthy said. Over the years, I think he's often extremely authoritarian, especially on terrorism subjects and civil liberties and such, but he has some good analysis on Trump, Russia, and Mueller, although I don't agree with all of it. But both he and Turley seem to suggest, and Dershowitz also suggested this, is that what ultimately Mueller and his team viewed as their role was basically as impeachment counsel for Congress, even though they were working under the auspices of the Justice Department. Meaning they extended the obstruction, so they pretty much almost certainly knew relatively quickly that there was no collusion case, no wider conspiracy case. Although, on the other hand, they did extend strands of the impeachment, of the collusion element of the investigation well into the end stages of the investigation. So they, interviewed Maria Butina in January of 2019 as just like crossing their T's and dotting their I's, I guess. So there's a little bit of ambiguity there, but at the very least, I think it's fair to say that they almost certainly had to know that the impeachment case was extraordinarily weak, or rather, sorry, the conspiracy case or collusion case was extraordinarily weak relatively early on in the investigation, which is why they never produced any indictments of Americans on conspiracy to, overthrow the 2016 election or whatever. But they devoted a huge amount of resources to obstruction. So the idea is that Mueller could have calculated that the reason why he didn't actually say whether he believed Trump committed a crime on obstruction is that if he had done so, then it would have gone to the Justice Department head, Barr and Rosenstein, to figure out what to do with that recommendation, and it probably would have been dragged out for months, if not years, in terms of the constitutionality of whether Trump can be charged. Remember, it's the OLC memo, which technically prohibits Mueller, prohibits an indictment actually being brought against Trump. But whether that's binding is an open legal question. Whether that memo can't just be thrown aside is an open legal question. It's not settled law, as I discussed with Dershowitz. So there would have been all kinds of very complex issues if Mueller actually had stated that he believed Trump committed a crime. But by saying he was not going to reach a determination one way or another, and yet laying out all this evidence on obstruction and collusion as well, but most potently probably obstruction, Mueller was actually doing this impeachment referral to Congress, even though he wasn't working for Congress. He was working for the Justice Department. So he kind of reinvented the role of the special counsel in a way, in a subtle, politically astute way. So that, I think, is a viable theory, and it was reinforced substantially by Mueller's performance this past week. So anyway, all that is to say that this was a very significant week for impeachment. So you even had Bernie, who had dragged his feet on this for a long time, now saying, okay, yeah, let's initiate impeachment proceedings. And one observation that I've made is that actually Elizabeth Warren has been proven to be a lot more strategically adroit than Bernie on this issue. So Warren, right away, right after she read the Mueller report on April 18th, she came out and said, yes, impeach now. And whether you agree with that in the substance, whether you agree with her analysis, which I do not, there's no denying that strategically, for her purposes, that was an advantageous move because it associated her with the call to impeach. She clearly saw that impeachment was coming down the line, or like at least greater discussion around the potentiality of impeachment was coming down the line. So for her to get out ahead of that issue and make a very firm, definitive proclamation as to what she thought should happen, impeachment, all the flurry and energy around impeachment in the Democratic primary electorate redounded to her benefit, and accordingly, she saw a significant uptick in the polls. There were even some polls where she overtook Bernie in the national polls. And just, sort of anecdotally, but it's still significant in terms of enthusiasm and stuff, she seems to be drawing larger crowds. Her social media engagement seems to be going way up. She just seems to be getting a lot of tangible and intangible benefits from having gone out ahead of the impeachment issue. Whereas Bernie, always just muddled through answers about whether he thought it was the right thing to do. He kind of changed the subject. And then eventually, later on, he ended up endorsing it anyway, and it doesn't actually benefit him politically. It benefits somebody like Warren, who also has the legal acumen where she can competently discuss the Mueller report, impeachment, whether crimes are prosecutable, whether the evidentiary case is sound enough to impeach on different articles. Whereas Bernie, that's just not his ballywick. He'd rather be talking about wealth inequality, single payer, this kind of thing. And Warren talks about substantive issues as well, but that's who Bernie fundamentally is. So now he ended up being put in this sort of paradoxical situation where he was pressured into endorsing the creation of a new political environment that will not be advantageous for him, I do not think. So a political environment dominated by impeachment, which is going to have, televised hearings, witnesses brought in, frenzied speculation every single day about this, that's going to be by far the top issue day to day in the media, in the Congress, etc., within the debates among the presidential candidates. And Bernie can't competently engage in that subject matter nearly to the level of a person like Warren. So Warren stands to gain, I think, from us entering into this phase where now impeachment is the number one issue day after day. And Bernie, I feel like, is not suited as much to that kind of political environment. So that kind of shows why he seems to have stagnated. He hasn't moved much in his polling recently. If anything, he seems to have gone down. I mean, he used to have a pretty substantial margin of his lead in especially New Hampshire, but now Biden's ahead in New Hampshire by double digits. And this just does not look good for Bernie in terms of at least the short to medium term. Now, who knows? Something could change, but, that's my assessment now. Bernie hadn't even read the report. BuzzFeed did this survey of all the presidential candidates where they just simply asked them, and I thought this was a great idea, have you read the report? Warren obviously has. Bernie, I forget exactly what his statement was, but it was obvious that he had not read the report. He read like a summary of it or something. Another significant factor that I think gets underplayed is Justin Amash, who is advocating the initiation of impeachment proceedings. He's the only Republican in Congress to have done so. First did it through a Twitter thread 2 weeks ago. Now, yes, he's the only Republican saying this, but he's still a Republican. So all Democrats need is the faintest patina of bipartisan support for impeachment to really bolster their case. And you have like former members of Congress who are Republicans saying this as well, which doesn't matter nearly as much, but still. And Amash, he's not shying away from this debate at all. He has a well-reasoned case for why he believes impeachment is necessary, or at least impeachment proceedings, because he hasn't said how he would vote on any forthcoming articles of impeachment. But that really makes a difference for him to be out there in public making the case for this very stridently. And I don't agree with his reasoning. I don't agree with his conclusions. But I can acknowledge that it took a principled stand for him to do this. Because he could incur serious political repercussions in his district. He already's got a primary challenger now in Michigan. The donations, I'm sure, are probably going to dry up for him. He is out there kind of maligning his leadership in the House and the Republican caucus. He did a town hall meeting this week in Grand Rapids, which was really fascinating. I actually encourage everyone to watch it. I'll link to it. Where, yeah, he had a lot of like fair weather supporters who were Democrats who came and cheering him and congratulating him for his courage. But he had a lot of Trump supporters who came and asked him very hostile questions. Now, sadly for them, most of these MAGA people who showed up with like their red hats were like incoherent babblers where they couldn't formulate a cogent thought for if their life depended on it. But there was one woman actually who had some kind of pro-Trump shirt on who did formulate a coherent thought and challenged him and said that she had volunteered on his campaign essentially in 2010. She knocked on hundreds of doors for him. She made hundreds of phone calls for him in 2010, or so she claimed, and voted for him in every subsequent election. And now she's basically accusing him of betrayal, of, grandstanding, forsaking his constituents, being a hypocrite, being, just after his own political ambitions. And there may be some element of truth to that, but I think in the main, he's motivated by an actual principled belief that this is the right thing to do. And I have to commend him for that, even if I disagree. He's taken other principled stances over the years that I do agree with, such as on foreign policy, civil liberties, other issues. So, I take him at his word that this is a result of his genuine reasoning, that it's principle-based. But that woman who had the contentious exchange with him challenged him for being a hypocrite because she said that, oh, you're so concerned about obstruction of justice and whatever, and you used to be this staunch libertarian opponent of state surveillance, which he has been, and yet you don't care about the FISA abuse that seems to have taken place with respect to Trump's campaign, and which, Barr is now investigating. I think that's actually a legitimate point. Amash did express openness to an investigation into whether FISA abuse took place, but he also made a good point on his own right, which is that he actually is one of the foremost advocates in the Congress to curtail the FISA law and make it so that the government can't invasively spy on ordinary Americans. And he tried to do that in 2018 by offering an amendment to the FISA Renewal Act, and it got nowhere because of Paul Ryan, who was then the Speaker. And Amash points out that all the Republicans complaining now about FISA abuse, so Devin Nunes, Jim Jordan, those types, Mark Meadows, they, I don't know, well, Amash singled out Nunes, so let's just take him because I'm not sure how Jordan and Meadows voted ultimately. But Amash pointed out that Nunes was all for the renewal of the FISA law, and not just that, but an increase in the in surveillance powers allowed under law by FISA. And then Trump signed that into law and said, "Oh, we got to do this because of 9/11." So Amash is right to point out the hypocrisy in Republicans and Trump whining about surveillance and FISA, and yet expanding it to suit their own purposes and invoking, specious terrorism rationales for doing this. So Amash pointed out that, oh yeah, these people claim that they're against FISA, but they don't care about FISA on principle. They're perfectly fine with ordinary Americans getting spied on. They just want to protect Trump. And I think there is some truth to that, even if I also believe that there are many, many legitimate concerns around how FISA was used in relation to the beginnings of the Russia investigation, and even later on into when Trump was president, because you had Rosenstein as late as May 2017, or I think maybe even June of 2017, renewing FISA's on Carter Page, and perhaps others that we don't know of right yet. So I actually do give Amash plaudits for that. And I think he actually is going to be a very prominent voice that eggs this along. And who knows, he may want to marshal it into a libertarian run in 2020 for president. I think he would probably get the nomination, although there probably are factions within the Libertarian Party who don't like impeachment and don't like his stance. So it actually be interesting to see how that plays out. But this idea that he has some corrupt motive or he's just doing it to further his own ambitions, I don't think it's right, because if he wanted to further his own ambitions, he'd just march in lockstep with the rest of the Republicans. So he could get, committee positions and get bills brought to the floor, because when he's maligning his leadership, that means they can just marginalize him. Anyway, we'll see. What else did I want to say? That's it. If you enjoyed this content, which I say somewhat sarcastically because I hate the way that term is used for the most part, consider a Patreon membership. Consider giving on PayPal. Subscribe here on YouTube. Subscribe on iTunes and Stitcher. And I will talk to you later.